actually very delighted about this because, first of all the speakers know each other, so they will be very direct, I think, with each other. No bullshit, maybe a bit. And for that reason, we would like to discuss this topic, right? It's a non-topic, actually, but it's still a topic. So it means it's not on any, not happening in any regulation yet, we think. Maybe Peter can clarify that for us, what Mika says about decentralized finance, and then we want to discuss what the member states think about it, and what actually DeFi projects think about themselves and how to be regulated. So maybe Peter, can you enlighten us a bit about what Mika says and does about decentralized finance?
Well, in a nutshell, Mika says that it doesn't cover decentralized finance, but many things that call themselves decentralized finance aren't decentralized finance. They're centralized finance or intermediated finance or intermediated crypto asset services provision, and those are covered by Mika. So if it is truly decentralized, if there is no one responsible for either the issuance of a coin or the management of an underlying protocol, like, for example, the blockchain protocol, but there are other protocols as well, that is truly decentralized. And even if we wanted to, with Mika, there's just no way to regulate that, because Mika, although it's a regulation for markets in crypto assets, deals with intermediaries. It deals with issuers, it regulates the issuers, and it regulates the service providers. But if there is no issuer, or if there is no service provider, then you're not covered. People who provide services, companies, intermediaries who provide services to Bitcoin are covered. But if there is no service provider, if it is genuinely a DAO or whatever you call these things, then there may be no focus for the regulation to apply, so that is exempted. And in its wisdom, the Council and the Parliament, actually in their wisdom, therefore, wrote at the end of the negotiations in Mika that the European Commission, so us, will come back in 18 months with a report and, if necessary or appropriate, proposals on a number of issues which are not covered or are a bit sort of strangely covered in Mika, and that is decentralized finance. So we'll have to write a report on something, on non-fungible tokens, on crypto lending. Those are the three issues which are mentioned. We will do that report because we always do what we're told. But that doesn't mean that we're going to limit ourselves to those three issues. We may cover other issues as well, whatever is current or worthwhile discussing when the time is right for this report, which would be around the end of 24, the beginning of 25. That's when we'll present this report. And people always ask me, what is the Commission going to write in this report on decentralized finance, and what are we going to do? And the short answer is, I don't know. And the reason is why I don't know is that we haven't really given it an awful lot of thought. And every time I speak anywhere, I say, I know it's a challenge to bring decentralized finance into the regulatory fold. I'm not even sure it's necessary, but should it be necessary, we need to have a new paradigm of how to do that. And anyone who has any great idea, even not such a great idea, on how to do this should come forward, should come and see us and explain to us how we should do it. I get many visitors coming to see me about all kinds of stuff, but no one has so far come forward with a great idea on how to do this. I remain hopeful that we still have a bit more than a year to go, that some of these great ideas are coming, and I'm really looking at Jan because he has many great ideas. So Jan, you're always welcome, and maybe these ideas will come. But maybe come this time next year, which is just before we're going to do this report, the entire debate about decentralized finance has completely disappeared. No one is interested in it anymore. A bit like couple of years ago, everyone was going on about ICOs and initial exchange offerings, and this was the big topic, and then they just disappeared. I'm not saying that decentralized finance will disappear. It may not. We'll see.
Thanks for that intro. I think that was as provocative as always, so we appreciate it. Talking about the council and the member states, I mean, you guys are responsible for the implementation and how this is to be read and then executed, right? So can you maybe explain a bit how the IMF particularly looks at this, and maybe also in a global context, what's happening and what you see is needed to be done, and what you maybe expect the Commission will write in the report?
Thank you very much, Robert. First of all, I want to say thank you very much for having me on this panel with very distinguished colleagues, guests as well, and giving me the opportunity to talk about this. So, from the French perspective, I'll just maybe give a quick background in terms. There's been quite a few things happening this year. The ACPR, which is our sister regulator, basically like the PRA in the UK, with the AMF, with like the FCA, with conduct regulator, markets regulator. They published a paper, which was a formal consultation on the subject of DeFi. It's quite a thorough paper. We then published our own discussion paper on the topic this year as well. And there's also like some ongoing work by sort of a legal circle of experts, more on the subject matter of DAOs and like, sort of decentralized autonomous organizations, and to try and give some legal certainty around that in France and what that may look like. So there's been quite a bit of work going on this year, and looking forward to continuing to receive responses and keeping the discussion ongoing. On how we see things in terms of, I'll speak on my behalf because obviously in the team we're the ones looking at that at the AMF. But I think the first thing is that the AMF's approach, and I can't speak obviously for all member states, so I'll give the example of the AMF within France. Our approach has always been, to try and strike that balance between innovation and addressing risks. Obviously, as a regulator, that's, the forefront of your mind, risk to consumers and to investors. So that's the first thing I'll say. The second thing I'll say is that, our paper, the discussion paper, had an element of very much being a fact-finding exercise in terms of identifying the layout. What are we dealing with? It wasn't so much, we took a step back maybe compared to what the ACPR did, where they made some proposals. We were like, okay, these are the discussion points we need to take into account in the context of what is DeFi, what are we looking at? So I think based on that first work, and this work's been going on for a while, it's not just the paper this year, there's been a lot of research in the years preceding that. We've identified some, there's definitely new things here. It's not just like same stuff. And though we did say, which maybe has stirred some controversy, I guess, same risk, same regulation, same rules or same outcomes, at least there is a degree of that. However, there are new things here as well. First of all, the technology is new. Well, maybe not new in itself, but at least in the context of financial activities, it's new. So smart contracts, decentralized protocols, which operate in an automated manner, obviously, but in the context of, providing financial activities, the different layers, the settlement on the blockchain, DApps, the fact that it's, potentially, some define it as open source software. All these aspects, in the context of providing financial activities, I'm not going to say services because it hasn't been defined yet, that's new. The second aspect is the activities. The way I see it is there's two things. DeFi, because of the technology, it proposes a new way of doing things which exist already. So there are some activities like exchange type activities, DEXs, AMMs, or even lending protocols. Those are activities which already exist in financial services, right? And I think the way sort of the technology works, it says we do it in an automated, decentralized manner. That's a new way of doing existing activities. There's also new areas which have emerged with DeFi, and I think that's another real question, because there are new activities in my mind. I mean, again, I haven't really found an equivalent out there in TradFi. So like aggregator type protocols or like liquid staking, those kind of questions, those are new things. So that's the second point. And I think the third point as well, which is also a very important question for us as regulators, is on governance, because even though governance is a time-old concept, financial services, it's as old as that, but in DeFi, it has taken new forms, and DAOs are a broader subject than DeFi, but a lot of DeFi type protocols have adopted that kind of modus operandi from a governance perspective. So I think my point here is that there are new things to deal with, and that should be looked at from a regulatory perspective. And then I'll obviously let John speak, but I think the other question, so once you've dealt with that content, is how to approach the subject matter. And I think in terms of what's already been done, obviously Mika, as Peter said, gives us a starting point with the question of what is entirely decentralized. And that is obviously, I think we're supportive of the idea of like having a view on that, and maybe there's criteria that, could be specified to identify what that means. And I think that's probably a good route to take maybe. But the question is also beyond that, there's still that question that I mentioned about these new things. How do you deal with that, right? And I think we shouldn't take the risk of putting new activities or new ways of doing things in boxes which might not be fit for purpose. So I think that's also a question that might need to be resolved. And there's different views as could it fit under MiCA? There's that question. Could it be a MiCA 2? I don't know. Could it be an ad hoc type regulation or a hybrid form of regulation where you do have certain aspects which have to be covered, like disclosure, like KYC, AML, obviously, like those kind of aspects, but also new aspects which might cater more to the technology. So both a mix of that same risk, same activity, same rules, as I mentioned, or same outcomes, but also how to cater to those new aspects I mentioned. So I think that's at least our thinking. We haven't received all the feedback yet to our discussion paper, but we're also looking to refine our thinking as it evolves, and look forward to see where it takes us. So.
Thanks for outlining that and elaborating on that. John, as a former regulator, now basically being in the DeFi space, when you listen to that, and I mean, you know both, and you know basically what's being discussed, are you worried about that? Is this encouraging? What's your perspective on that?
Thanks. I think this is pretty much the best we can hope for. And I think this is what we're looking to engage on, because I think, as Peter says, MiCA, and I think that's very important to highlight, Peter said it well, like it was a deliberate choice. I often hear people like shortcomings, hopes that we didn't get to cover DeFi, but it was never considered. It was very deliberate. We do not know enough about decentralization and a world without traditional financial intermediaries that are regulated entities that you need to get access. Because I think that's important when we talk about intermediaries. In a decentralized world, we offer an interface, several people do, but if you have the technical know-how, you actually do not need us. So I think that's a very important point. What Peter came onto is that traditionally financial legislation applies to intermediaries. And then, as Olivier says, it's that we know that for every DeFi protocol, after MiCA, even before MiCA, whether you're in a jurisdiction where you don't have a MiCA yet, you're gonna look at it from a decentralized name only. That kind of caught on. That's kind of a thing over the past year and a half. And everyone from the BIS to other standard setters will say, well, first of all, which I would also do if I was still a regulator, you will see if there is actually not anyone controlling that protocol, as you should do. But I think what they're doing in France, both with the ACPR and the AMF, is saying, okay, we recognize that will be part of the discussion. We will have first, is a protocol fully decentralized or not, as MiCA says, which essentially means, does anyone actually control the Uniswap protocol? Can anyone make unilateral changes, any one person or entity? If not, okay, it's probably a safe bet that it's fully decentralized. There will be, of course, questions on governance, questions on a whole range of things. And then you have the separate discussion, which is whether or not an interface, which is a proprietary product for a lot of commercial providers, whether that fits in Title V. But those are two separate discussions. And the AMF goes a step further, as does the ACPR, saying, okay, so if one is out and the other is not covered, then what? What do we need to look at? And how do we do it? And as Peter says, there has been a lot of ideas. We have some idea how to do it, but there hasn't been anything that I for sure can say will resonate enough with regulators, traditional financial regulators, because it requires, I think, more compromise than you're used to on both sides. Because you can, of course, come up, if you're not in the European Union, you can come up with a bunch of rules saying, well, we will just block access or we will just ban it. That's really not how we're used to doing things, especially from the Commission's perspective. So you want to promote economic activity if there is good, responsible innovation. And then, of course, you want to protect consumers, you want to protect the markets. But none of us has really figured out what does it mean in this world where you will have, again, a host of interfaces. They will have very different functionalities. Some will get close to what we know from Mika. Some will maybe even be ChatGPT. What happens when I just prompt ChatGPT to write my transaction and give me a wallet and make it on Uniswap? Or Telegram, where you can already do this with a chatbot. So, and you can have just browsers. No routing, no smart thinking behind it, but you're just giving the user the possibility to read in clear text what is in the different pools. So there's going to be a lot of questions on definitions, but I think, as mentioned in the beginning, the most we can hope for is that we can actually engage on this discussion, which I think we're able to do, not just in France, but several places, especially in the EU. And I think the benefit we have here is that Mika is there. So we can have a more factual discussion about the next step, whereas if you go in other jurisdictions, it's all kind of piled together, which is, of course, the biggest risk for us, is that nobody will look at crypto assets. I hate centralized finance as a word, but traditional centralized exchanges, DeFi, they will look at it just the same because it's just all crypto. And there I feel that, at least in the EU, we can have it a little more at an advanced level, fully recognizing that a lot of things that market themselves as DeFi maybe are not. But what if they are? What do we do? Who do we need to protect, and how do we do it? So yeah, I don't think we can hope for much more than open engagement on this discussion.
Yeah, the follow-up question then for me is looking at that also with the speed that is being taken now to address that. Are we rushing it? I mean, are we going too fast with this? Do we need to do more research? Do we need more data? I mean, as a regulator, you want to make a good decision for the whole ecosystem, right? And also and the European Commission for the whole of the EU. But the debates we're seeing, in my opinion, I mean, that's my personal opinion, and maybe you guys disagree, but I have the feeling that there's a bit of a fear on not getting it done fast enough, and therefore there's maybe a rush there that I think if it goes too fast, we make mistakes that not necessarily need to be made. Is this like a realistic assumption, or is this like just maybe my outside perspective without having all the insight that you both have?
I guess I'm happy to take that one first, maybe, Robert. So on that, I think there's definitely a question of timing, for sure. But on that, with that, I'll also conflate another question is, how does this start, I think, and I think what we're seeing, we wanted to just initiate the discussion, really. It wasn't like the idea of saying DeFi needs to be regulated and this is how it should be done, even though there's already been some work done on that as well, the French level and maybe at the international level. We'll talk about that maybe. I think the idea is to, what we're starting to see in terms of feedback is that, and this is by all kinds of actors who've come back to us, but the decentralization, and I think this will echo what's already been discussed, is on a spectrum. I think we can all agree to that. So I think, and I think John was saying that, there might be cases which are closer to Mika, and there might be cases which are completely new and outside of that. So I think based on that, that's where, and again, coming back to the point, what does it mean to be fully decentralized? I think that's where that discussion at least can start. And I think, it will be very welcome when the Commission, comes around to it eventually, to have that discussion with them, in terms of how they see those things, or I guess the report which will eventually be published. I think that will be sort of a first impetus in terms of having that discussion. So I think the question of timing is right, but I think it's also about getting it right. And from my perspective, I mean, I like to think we took it's a big word, but scientific approach, in the sense that our paper, and I think the ACPRs as well, which was very thorough, was very much, okay, what are we dealing with again here, And I think on that basis, then you build and I think that's been the EU's approach in general. I mean, I don't want to obviously speak on behalf of the Commission, but, that's always been like, what are we dealing with here? And then how do you build on that? So I don't think there's a rush in that sense, but it's about getting it right. If it has to be regulated. So.
No, indeed, we don't, and I don't have any sense of urgency on sorting out DeFi. First of all, because a lot of what's called DeFi isn't DeFi, and this is already covered. And there is definitely a sense of urgency on getting MiCA implemented, and that's what we're focused on. But for the remaining space that does exist, we don't even know how big it is, and we don't even know whether it's problematic. You could sort of say, well, it's problematic as a point of principle because no one should escape regulation. But what is the market reality of this? How much of this activity really falls outside of the regulatory perimeter? Is it a lot? Is it not a lot? I don't know. And does that create real problems where people lose their money, get defrauded or whatever? Are there really big problems? So that sense of urgency isn't there yet. Another sense of urgency may be created, I don't say it will, but it may be created if the lack of a legal clarity and the lack of a policy framework prevents that community from developing and from mainstreaming. And that, for example, was one of the motivations behind MiCA, is that we were confronted on the one hand with a sense of urgency because a large social network had a wonderful idea to launch a stablecoin, and that created an immediate sense of urgency. And that together with the fact that the community was kind of said, look, we want to progress, but the regulatory framework is so unclear that we can't. And that created a sense of urgency to then push it forward. I've not come across anyone from the DeFi community, which of course is very hard because some people come forward and say, I represent DeFi. I said, that's not possible, because if you represent DeFi, then you must represent someone centralized, because you can't represent no one unless you've declared yourself the spokesperson for decentralization. So anyway, they haven't come forward. No one who's active in this space has come forward and saying, look, you really have to put some rules in place or some policy in place, because without it, we can't develop, we can't grow. I don't know why they haven't come forward, maybe because it's not necessary, or because they're afraid, and possibly with good reason, that the rules which we may come up with are not going to be to their liking. And of course, that is a legitimate fear, and then they shouldn't give us any bad ideas on what to do.
I mean, I totally understand why they're afraid. I mean, you're terrifying, Peter, sometimes. John, counter-ask. So the European regulators are in no rush. Is the industry in a rush to get the rules out?
I think that's a good question. I think so we, of course, engage as much as possible. We are, of course, also rather representing access to a rather large decentralized protocol. But I think there's two things here. There's, of course, what Peter says, that I think DeFi as a community is very, very broad as well. You have very small players and you have some very big players. And I think I'm kind of guessing here on behalf of the community, but you're kind of waiting also for regulators to be as open as the gentlemen sitting next to me are about having this discussion. And in other jurisdictions outside of the EU, you know very well that it's a big no-no to go and speak to a regulator, because you should be afraid if they don't understand it, they will just throw some old rules at it. And that does happen. I would say that we are definitely in a rush if it is updated and good, supportive regulation. So I kind of feel like it's of course easy to say, but I kind of just want what MiCA did for crypto assets. That's what we want for DeFi. We are of course afraid that now in the European Union you will have interpretations of MiCA, and people will say, okay, MiFID definitely didn't fit. Now we have MiCA, it's closer, so we will just use that on DeFi as well, which I think would be a very big mistake, because MiCA is actually closer to MiFID and crypto assets are closer to financial instruments than DeFi is to traditional finance. It's the concepts underlying and the way that you will have to do this are very different, which is why it was so hard. We didn't touch it in the MiCA negotiations. There was no one fighting to say, let's do it now. Everyone was happy to say, let's look at it in 18, 24, and 48 months. That's fine, because we need to have some time for us to fully understand, and potentially, as Peter says, for the DeFi sector to like mature and come out and engage on this point, which also, if you remember, took time for the broader crypto asset sector and ended up in a pretty good spot. I mean, I know that Peter will recall that in the early days back in 2017, 18, it was very different discussions you would have with innovators in the crypto asset space compared to 2021, when they had all kind of better prepared themselves and understood where regulators were coming from. You were able to have a much better discussion and take into account some of their concerns. So MiCA did not just become a new MiFID, but actually try to cater to the differences. So I would say, whether or not we're not pushing for quick regulation, as you said in the beginning, we're pushing for something that would make sense, because we do want something where regulators are comforted that this space, however small, is allowed to develop more. And that's why I think some kind of approach where you, as the EMF and ACPR do, you separate it into, okay, so who are these new types of interface providers? What about the DeFi protocols? And what about the public permissionless blockchains? What can we do at these three levels? Is it something that will come in stages? Do we find a regulatory hook with the centralized interfaces and try to make them help us push down in terms of security? Because, as you know, that's one of our biggest jobs, I would say, as the provider of an interface, is to make sure that it's safe for our users. Nobody in DeFi wants people to get scammed or rug pulled. I mean, and this is one of the biggest issues that we have, that we have an open protocol. Everyone can provide liquidity, which is the sole innovation with a trading or a decentralized exchange. Everyone can become a liquidity provider, but it also means that you can put any kind of crap up there. And of course, as an interface, trying to make sure that it's safe for people to engage, trying to monitor and check if something clearly looks like a scam, and then remove that token so it's not available to a user who doesn't know what they're doing. That's, of course, one of the jobs. And I think that's kind of where safety becomes like a competitive advantage for us. Like, you would rather use the ones where you didn't get scammed. But yeah, so we're definitely looking for certainty. But I mean, we would also take voluntary frameworks, certification, anything that is kind of forward-looking or allows it to continue to grow without us waiting for some jurisdiction to interpret MiCA differently than others, because that's a risk that we have. We don't get the MiCA passport, so we will have to engage across the EU and try to figure out, how do people view the interface? How do they view the protocol? How do they view a non-custodial wallet, which is also something we're hearing now. Non-custodial wallets that provide access might also be interpreted as actually being an intermediary, even if it is not one in the traditional sense of the word. So I think those are the things we're careful of. But we'll be sure to come both to AMF and Peter with hopefully good ideas. I'm sure they won't take all of it, but if they took a little.
If I could just add to maybe what John said, I think there is one very important point, is that, and I did mention it in the new aspects of DeFi, but de facto, DeFi is actually cross-border. And I think that's a very important aspect to take into account. And as John said, what he just said there, that you'd have to go and talk to each individual member state or regulator, to see if it's okay, or whatever the idea is. I think that's a very key question. And again, we might come to the international side and what's been done there, but the EU at least has, it's, even though it's not the entire world, it's already a pretty big block. And I think it can address that cross-border, and obviously convergence, as the supervisory authorities do. It can help to address that question as well. So even though there is, maybe I'll still state that there is no urgency from that perspective, and we still want to get it right. Well, at least from where I stand, the idea is also effectively, following on what from you just described, there is that aspect of, cross-border cooperation and that way, because these entities, well, not entities, but they are decentralized, you know, where people can access them from anywhere. The internet doesn't actually acknowledge the borders, and that's a fact, you know. So there is that, I guess, is more on the side of the urgency, and how do we deal with this, I guess, sooner rather than later, because it exists, you know.
Yeah, that's a very good point. But I would like to take one of the questions, or some of the questions that we got from our audience online. And one is, how can DeFi balance anonymity and compliance as EU regulatory scrutiny intensifies? Anybody wants to answer that? Very easy one.
It's $1 million question, that.
Well, I'll give a very legalistic answer. That if DeFi operators aren't data processors or data controllers, then they're not subject to privacy rules, because the privacy rules are administered through data controllers and data processors. And they say, well, how can you balance that and compliance? And my question is, well, compliance with what? If you are outside of the regulatory perimeter, there is no need to comply, because there are no rules other than general rules of law, which everyone has to go comply with, but there are no specific rules you have to comply with. So balancing your compliance is like balancing nothing. And balancing compliance with privacy is balancing nothing with nothing. So I don't know. I don't really see what this aims at.
I think the aim, just to interpret it here, was what if there would be regulation for DeFi, right? And that's a big question. How do you deal with anonymity? And we have a panel about specifically like zero knowledge proof and pseudonymity and all these things. And I think we could probably elaborate just on that for a while, but we'd rather keep this for later. I just wanted to give the floor to some of the questions, because actually we get a lot of them. And maybe I take another one. When DeFi projects are sufficiently decentralized and what does it say? And have you seen? Do you have, or sorry, I will reformulate this question because it's a bit not so clear. Have you seen any decentralized projects that are sufficiently decentralized? That's a question to Peter specifically.
Well, I know these things come in gradation, but I'm a simple person, and therefore I take a binary look. You are decentralized or you're not. It's like pregnancy. You can't be a little bit pregnant. You either are or you're not. And the same is with decentralization, is that I don't sort of get involved into sort of when have you reached the stage of sufficient decentralization. I know it's a very big debate. Personally, this is not the European Commission official position, because I never present the European Commission's official position, and we actually don't have a position on it. But I don't believe that going down the route of determining the cutoff point of when you have sufficient decentralization is actually going to be workable. And I don't think, I may be wrong, that a consensus among, for example, the EU member states, or more globally in, say, for example, IOSCO or Basel, about what is the cutoff point of sufficient decentralization, that a consensus on that is possible. So therefore, I would say at a certain moment you have to take more of a binary route. You are decentralized or you're not.
No, I agree with Peter. I think it's very, very tricky to come up with something, which is also why you have the recital 22 that just says fully decentralized without going into what does that mean, because that will be a supervisory question. I know that some, especially in the EU, they are looking at this. They're trying to come up with at least some indicators that would lean towards, okay, this is check, this goes towards something actually being decentralized. So are the smart contracts immutable? Is there a minimized governance? Maybe even in the future, and I know that Olivier and I have spoken about this, I think you probably will have bunch of very simple DeFi protocols that don't even have a DAO. I mean, if there's no DAO, if it just runs, if there's even no governance structure behind it and it just operates, it's going to be very tricky to say that this is not decentralized from a regulatory perspective. But I think more to Peter's point, I think at a certain point, at least that's something I noticed speaking to regulators and also just before being at the commission, at a certain point, we kind of stopped questioning Ethereum. It just kind of, now it's just there. So, and I know in France you also have regulated financial institutions that have issued stuff on Ethereum. And I think the way we think about it is that if you get to a stage where you have either voluntary or mandatory frameworks, and you want to also from the industry perspective to get financial institutions involved to try to either, in our case, provide liquidity, maybe the obligation falls on them. Maybe we come to a stage where a DeFi protocol is accepted the same way as the Ethereum virtual machine and the Ethereum blockchain is. So it becomes the obligation of the financial institution that wants to get involved to show to the regulator that this is, we trust this sufficiently. This is decentralized. Nobody will make a decision that we don't know about overnight and change the whole concept of the activity we want to provide through it. That could be a way. Maybe that's also something that falls on the interface. The interface provider might have to be the responsible party for checking that the DeFi protocol they provide access to in a new type regulation is actually decentralized and is actually safe. So that's just one, I mean, that's again building on the notion of these gatekeepers and people looking into what is essentially just technology. And then again, I know about, we have the spectrum, you have some governance structures where you can actually make changes, and then you have the ones where you can literally make like nothing that would matter, because otherwise, again, people would not build towards the Uniswap protocol if Uniswap Labs or anyone else or the DAO could overnight just change like the way it works, or say now we do lending or now we do something else. It would not be safe to engage with it for other builders. So I think that's very important. And I think that would be one idea to place it, because as Peter says, coming up with like a checklist is going to be very difficult, at least among a lot of jurisdictions.
As we're unfortunately coming slowly to an end, I want to ask you all one question. I mean, we sit here and I think acknowledge the fact that this is the beginning of a road or a journey to hopefully a very positive outcome, both for consumers, investors, and the industry, right? But let's assume you have to come up with a definition of decentralization, because that's what we actually need first to discuss then probably decentralized finance, I would assume. Do you know a good definition that you have in mind where you say like, look, that's clear to me, that's defining what decentralization is? Have you seen that? And what does it look like, if it exists? I mean, you can also make it up on the spot.
Well, yeah, well, you know, I always make things up on the spot. But to me, decentralization really is, I can only define it negatively. It's the absence of a controlling entity or group.
I tend to take, well, it's not something we've actually thought about, because it's so, I think, how do you define something which is multiple, right? And there's so many moving parts. So I'm not sure I fully join John's position. I think the view is it would be useful to have some criteria. So again, going back to the terms we have about fully decentralized, etc. But at the same time, the way you have to look at it is also in practice, and I do believe that there is a spectrum, because there's just so many use cases out there. So I think the way we'll look at it, in the immediate, because we in the team we also see a lot of project owners and stuff, is always on a case-by-case basis. So that's the immediate answer I'll give. It's not a satisfactory answer because it doesn't address your question, Robert. But I think the difficulty is in defining something which is multiple, in the sense that, as John said, you look at Ethereum, it's just been accepted now, I guess, as a public good, for lack of a better term. How do you define that? What does that become? It's essentially like a mini version within the world of Web 3.0 of what the internet is. It's a distributed protocol. But what makes it decentralized? I think that's still something we haven't really defined, and hopefully, ongoing discussions could help out. But yeah, it's very good. I'm not giving you an answer, I'm afraid, but maybe I'll take the same line as Peter to start.
I think I would add the finance part of it, and then go to actually the title of the ACPR, where they say disintermediated or decentralized finance. And I think it's very important to recognize that before crypto, we still had disintermediation, but disintermediation still meant regulated access, regulated entities that you needed as a consumer to go through. And as I said in the beginning, the way I see decentralized finance, not that us mere mortals who don't know how to code will do it, but you can actually access it. Whoever you are, if you write software, you can access it yourself. You don't have to go through anyone. And I think that's the part of it that is what makes it difficult, is that we can come up with a new regulation, but you can build something else that provides the same kind of access, or you can do it entirely yourself. You can download a software development kit, install it on a computer, and don't have anyone that is helping you. So I think that part of the decentralized, that openness and access, I think is what makes something decentralized.
On that note, I think we'll end. If you guys have any ideas about how to regulate or define that, then I'm pretty sure they're very open to any suggestions. Thanks for joining. Thanks for taking the time. Please, a round of applause for our panel. And then I hand over to Tommy.